Just want to say hello to everyone. My name is Jim Trotter. I'm a reporter with NFL Network, and I'm honored to be part of this virtual town hall because we're at an inflection point in this country's history. And the work that the Players Coalition is doing to educate and advocate is going to go a long way in hopefully creating real and positive change. To give you some background about the Players Coalition, it was founded by Anquan Boldin and Malcolm Jenkins in 2017. And to this day, it is led by players and for the players. It started with 5 guys going to Capitol Hill in 2016 to learn how they could use their platforms to make positive change. What they learned was that the work was most impactful at the city and state levels. 99% of the coalition's work is hyper-local, but there are times that there is considerable overlap between markets, which results in campaigns that look to find solutions to systemic reform on the national level. With support from the group's expansive pool of subject matter experts, the coalition is able to activate across the country in spaces that connects athletes with grassroots organizations, thus amplifying the work that those groups are doing while also allowing the Players Coalition members to stay connected with those groups. Today, support includes athletes and coaches, current and former, from across multiple sports leagues, all advocating for reform in criminal justice, police and community relations, and education and economic advancement. So why this conversation? Obviously, social justice has been at front and center since the murder of George Floyd. His death, along with the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and the shooting of Jacob Blake, has created a movement whose purpose and passion is as great as the numbers supporting it. People want to see policing transformed, and they want to roll back a mass incarceration system that keeps 2.1 million people behind bars, with an additional 4.5 million under some form of supervised release. And that disproportionately harms and targets Black and brown people. There's a lot of focus on the protests that are taking place in both the streets and in sporting venues. To achieve real change, however, there needs to be tangible action at every level of government. There is the need to elect officials who actually care about holding police accountable and rolling back mass incarceration. There needs to be legislators who will pass reform bills and increase budgets, and there needs to be governors who will sign these bills into law. The coalition also believes there needs to be leaders who are unafraid of powerful police lobbies that want to push back against change and preserve their unquestioned power. In fact, in California, the police unions are expected to spend $10 million this year alone trying to push back on reforms. The next few months in California will go a long way toward determining whether society moves forward in changing our criminal legal system or whether it will roll back a lot of the reforms implemented in California that have helped to create a more fair and equitable system. With that said, I'd like now to turn it over to our panelists and experts who will be leading us through today's conversation about criminal justice and policing reform in California. Please welcome Cam Lynch, a former player for the Rams and Buccaneers and an NBA candidate. Anthony Lynn, head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. Jed York, CEO of the San Francisco 49ers. Irwin, founder and director of Smart Justice California and a former public defender in San Francisco. Natasha Minsker, policy advisor at Smart Justice California and previously of the ACLU of Northern California. James King, state campaigner of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. And finally, Marc Philpart, managing director at PolicyLink. And with that, I will turn it over to Jed York.
Thank you so much for hosting, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody. My first question is for James. Can you briefly talk us through the history of how California became one of the most incarcerated places in the country, and obviously therefore the world, and how this state has rolled back some of those harsh practices?
In 1978, California had an incarceration rate of less than 150 people per 100,000 people throughout the state. It was fairly, according to those standards at the time, reasonable number. And today we're at over 581 per 100,000 people in the state. So we've increased 5 times our incarceration rate over the course of the last 40 years. There's a myriad of factors. One is that the law enforcement mechanism, like the district attorneys, the police, and the policing unions and the legislators have all kind of like formed a climate in which we are increasing our incarceration rates throughout the state. What I mean by that is there's been a number of laws that have passed over the course of the last 25 years that have raised the amount of people who are within our prisons right now. One of the most notable was California's 3-strike law, which was passed in 1994. California's 3-strike law at the time was the most draconian sentence in the history of this country. It said that if a person had 1 prior felony for a serious or violent crime, then their second sentence would be doubled up. The third sentence would then be automatically 25 years to life. As an example, I have a friend who recently came home this year who just served 25 years for shoplifting a pair of blue jeans in a store in 1994. He's 70 years old, and I'm glad he made it home. But he's an example of the type of sentencing and sentencing laws throughout the late 80s and throughout the late 90s that our state favored. In 2011, there was a ruling from the United States Supreme Court in Brown v. Plata, which ruled that our state prisons were so horribly overcrowded that it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The courts set a 3-judge panel, which then ordered our prisons to cap their incarceration capacities at 137.5%. As of that year, and with that event, a series of modest reforms began. That same year in 2011, there was AB Assembly Bill 109, which diverted some of the less serious crimes like drug possessions from state prisons into county jails. And I just want to point out that that was not a reduction of incarceration. It was just moving some people from state prison to serve time in county jails. The very next year in 2012, California voters passed Prop 36, which said that a 3rd strike had to be either violent or serious. So you could no longer give a person a life sentence for shoplifting. In 2014, California voters passed Proposition 47, which changed certain felonies like drug possession and made them misdemeanors, again, modestly reducing the incarceration rates throughout the state. Jim mentioned at the very beginning that this country incarcerates 2.1 million people right now. I want to point out that as of right now in California, there are over 240,000 people incarcerated. So over 10% of the incarcerated people within this country are in this state right now today. And that's prisons, jails, federal detention facilities, and ICE detention facilities. So we still have a long way to go. We've done some skimming around the edge of who's being sentenced and how long that they're in for, but we need some bold vision for dramatic reductions in order to truly counter the incarceration rates that we have in this state.
Thank you, James. And we heard a lot about the reforms from James a little bit, and there are folks that claim that this has led to more crime. Can you talk through that, whether that's truth, fiction, or where things lie?
Thank you, Jed. Really nice to be here. The good news is that California crime rates are at historic lows, and the reduction in crime in California has really been statewide, and it is true of violent crime and property crime. And I think what's remarkable is that it was 2006 when California really began, policymakers in California and then voters in California began to embrace reform. And beginning in 2007, our incarceration rates began to decline. So between 2006, over the last 15 years, basically, incarceration has gone down, and so has crime. So you have not seen an increase in crime as we have been turning away from mass incarceration in California. You've actually seen the opposite. And the numbers are pretty significant. Since 2006, property crime has dropped by about a quarter in California, 25%. Since 2006, violent crime has dropped by about 20%. So it's clear that there is not a relationship between choosing a different path and public safety, right? You don't have to worry about crime going up if you're going to begin to de-incarcerate. And I just want to note, I think sometimes folks feel that crime must be going up because they're getting notifications on their like Nextdoor app saying, all day long saying suspicious person in the neighborhood, or noting every car break-in that happens every month in the neighborhood. And so it creates a sense in your mind that crime must be going up. But that is anecdotal data. And the good news is that the actual data is telling us that we are safer now in California than we have been in decades.
Thank you very much, Ann. And this is a question to all of our experts on the panel. Historically, what have been the major obstacles to the changes that we've been discussing?
I'll jump in with the power of prosecutors. One of the problems we have is that district attorneys have been very aligned with a tough on crime view. District attorneys here in California are elected, and they have viewed their approach to re-election as the more people I put in prison, the higher my conviction rates. That's what I should be running on for re-election. The alternative vision would be prosecutors that are focused on justice and safety. That's not been the way prosecutors have sought re-election, and they have really trumpeted the view that them as prosecutors putting more people in prison is how they should do their job. And so in the political sphere here in California, prosecutors have been some of the leading voices for longer sentences, and in particular for shifting power away from judges and to prosecutors. 97% of cases in California are resolved through plea bargaining. We tend to think that the judge is the person who's imposing these sentences. 97% of the time, it's really the prosecutor that's imposing a sentence as a result of a plea bargain. And the tougher, more draconian the sentencing laws are, the harder it is for a person to go to trial and assert their rights. And that's what gives power to the prosecutors that leads them to driving up the incarceration rates. And those prosecutors are very forceful in Sacramento in making their voices heard.
I'll jump in and add to that. Law enforcement unions have been a huge impediment to reform and change in California. This last legislative session, we were reminded just how powerful law enforcement unions are. They fought tooth and nail. One of the meaningful, really impactful police reform bills that was up, and they did a really good job of scaring legislators, and that bill failed. And that was because of law enforcement. And when we say law enforcement unions, we're talking about local police unions and sheriff's unions, statewide police and sheriff unions, and then prison guard union. And in California, the prison guard union has the deepest pockets. It's one of the wealthiest unions in California, and they have been, they really kind of spearheaded the race to incarcerate in California in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. They have clear economic benefit that flows from building more prisons and incarcerating more bodies. And they are showing up again and spending millions this year to fight reforms. And for them, it is, you know, primarily economic, but there also is an ideology behind it. They have created a deep us versus them mentality, that they are on the side of right, and that they are protecting people from bad people. And so we are fighting this economically driven and also ideologically driven, very powerful set of unions.
I'd add one thing to that, which is the fear mongering that is taking place by the press and various politicians over the course of the last few decades. We're all familiar with the name, for instance, Willie Horton. We know what it means when someone says soft on crime, or conversely, to be tough on crime, which has been a political virtue for several years, is to be tough on crime. And so the rhetoric around, or misunderstandings around what actually creates safety in our community, which is affordable housing, which is decent medical care, which is jobs and education, mental health support, as opposed to crime and punishment, or a crime and punishment model, has been really difficult for creating the type of template that makes reducing the incarceration rates the reasonable expectation that it should be.
I'd just like to add that it's the combination of all of these different law enforcement related stakeholders really conspiring and colluding to preserve their power and advance their agenda in the Capitol that really dampens the environment for fertile progressive reform in that building. You have 120 legislators and a governor who feel threatened when these individuals align themselves around a certain agenda that is focused on both the individual lawmakers' ability to maintain a good record and be well liked, as well as that lawmaker's ability to move other things that they care about. And these are things that these entities have the ability to do. They're able to subvert someone's campaign. They're able to subvert an entire legislative agenda for a legislator. And the consequences can be disastrous for some folks. We see a lot of retribution campaigns that these entities launch for lawmakers who stand up and try to advance a progressive agenda. And this happens at the local level, but also at the state level. And so there's a considerable amount of power that we have to overcome in order to advance the type of reforms that I believe we all want.
Thank you, everybody. Coach, I'll toss it over to you if you have any questions.
Let me get myself off mute first. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on this Zoom. You know, our organization, Los Angeles Chargers, you know, we committed to winning the championship this year and fighting for social justice. And I do not believe this is a distraction. For any of our fans out there that may think this could be a distraction, trust me, it is not. These young men on our football team, they're so passionate about wanting change that it would be a distraction if we did not let them use their platform to speak up and try to create change for our country. So I do have a couple of questions for you guys. This is for Marc, Annie, and Natasha. You know, despite some pushback, this was a very strong legislative session for criminal justice reform. You know, can we talk about what's passed and what's on the table for the governor?
I'll start here and just say that While there has been a great deal of progress, I can't help but feel the weight and the sadness associated with how bleak things are, knowing that there are so many other bills that we wanted to make it to the governor's desk that did not have the chance to do so, knowing that Breonna Taylor's killers are going unpunished and not being held accountable. These are things that I think for any Black person, any person who cares about justice in this country, these are things that make this conversation hard and difficult. And so while I agree with the sentiment that there has been progress, I think it's important to reflect upon how much more we have to do. And this year, there were some pretty landmark reforms that made it to the governor's desk, and it still remains to be seen whether the governor will indeed sign those things. Just a few to lift up for you, especially in the realm of policing, that I think are important, that we've been advocating for. One is immediately after the murder of George Floyd, the governor worked with members of the legislature to introduce a ban on chokeholds in California. We know that some cities have done this already, and issuing a statewide ban would bring us in line with where many people are around the country in terms of 21st century policing practices, and that banning chokeholds alone is not enough to get to the reform that we need and to the transformation in that in community safety that we need. But it is a big step, and that is on the governor's desk, AB 1196, authored by Assemblymember Mike Gibson. We're excited about that and hope that that will indeed be signed by the governor. We believe it will be because he expressed support for it at the outset and really was the catalyst for it. And so we're glad that he stood up immediately after George Floyd was killed and made that proclamation. Another bill, AB 2054, the Crisis Act, authored by Assemblymember Kamlager out of Los Angeles. The Crisis Act stands for a Community Response Initiative to Strengthen Emergency Systems. And this bill really captures the hopes and aspirations of the movement of people who are committed to re-envisioning public safety and really committed to community-based approaches to safety. There's a mantra in our movement, we keep us safe, and the Crisis Act really embodies that. This bill creates a grant program that would essentially invest in community organizations who are responding to emergencies across the state. This is an innovative approach that no state has embarked upon before, but communities throughout the country are doing this work on a day in and day out basis. In Sacramento and Oakland, for example, Mental Health First is operating a hotline that people can call to receive immediate support and get connected to ongoing care regarding mental health emergencies. In Los Angeles, organizations like Second Call and Mustard Seed are intervening to build peace during neighborhood conflicts and also to stop intimate partner violence. In the Bay Area, the Berkeley Free Clinic is working to provide healthcare services to people who are unsheltered and who are struggling with substance abuse. And so these innovative practices and approaches are really about caring first and not sending law enforcement officers with a gun and a badge into situations that can easily be resolved with support, with the help of trained professionals. And so we're hoping that the governor signs AB 2054, the Crisis Act. It is desperately needed in order to stem the tide of police violence that we all feel and see throughout the state and country.
And I'll lift up another great bill that's on the governor's desk, the California Racial Justice Act, AB 2542 by Assemblymember Ash Kalra. The California Racial Justice Act prohibits racial discrimination in convictions and sentences, and it creates a process to challenge racial discrimination at trial or following conviction. Now, when you hear that, you probably are thinking, isn't that already the law? And the shocking thing is, it is not. There is no law in California that prohibits racial discrimination in convictions and sentences, which is why the Racial Justice Act is desperately needed. This is a bill that will really confront racism in our criminal courts. The bill brings civil rights law into the criminal courts for the first time. We have civil rights law for housing, public accommodation, employment. The reality is, in this country, there are no civil rights laws for the criminal courts. The California Racial Justice is that act, and California would be the first in the nation to pass a bill such as this, applying to all convictions and sentences.
This year, the legislature, and we're expecting, hoping the governor to sign, took a huge step with AB 823. It is a bill that will close the state-run youth prisons once and for all. So currently in California, we have about 650 children who are living in state prisons. There are 3 facilities housing these roughly 650 children. AB 823 will close over the next few years those facilities, and instead, justice-involved kids will stay much closer to home, much closer to their families, and will start to build out in California a robust community-based model for holding these kids in, keeping them close to their familial networks, and really trying to focus on a healing-based program for the kids that can redirect their path. One of the things we were really proud of in this bill, and took an incredible amount of work from a large coalition that has been working for so long on protecting kids in California who are justice involved, was that there will be a statewide oversight agency to make sure that we have 58 counties in California, and we need to make sure that kids in every one of those counties are being protected if they're justice involved and are getting really high quality services. So this is monumental to actually close state youth facilities, prisons. And I think this is going to be the beginning of a new journey for kids in California over the next couple of decades. I also want to lift up a bill that is sitting on the governor's desk, and we are quite worried about whether or not he's going to sign it. It's AB 1950. It is a landmark probation reform bill. So for the last, since 2006, so 15 years, we have started to look critically at excessive sentencing, at how we treat justice-involved kids, at different pieces, at treatment over incarceration for people who are addicted to drugs or mentally ill. One of the last frontiers that we have just begun to scratch the surface is the supervision state. And the supervision state, just as we were building out jails, building out prisons, we were also building out this very intense web of supervision, probation, parole. And now we are finally starting to look at the data about whether this web of supervision is effective, and if it is effective, what pieces of it are effective, in what form is it effective. So we took the first step in passing AB 1950, and what it does is it shortens probation periods. Rather than the default being that felony probation is 3 or 5 years long and misdemeanor probation is 3 years long, this reduces those to a 2-year maximum for felony probation in California for most kinds of felonies, and a 1-year maximum for misdemeanor probation in California for most kinds of misdemeanors. And this is, again, data driven about what is the length of supervision that actually is helpful for someone to get back on their feet, right? Get resources, get job training, and not so long that it becomes a lag that drags them back into the criminal justice system, as we have all seen over and over and over again. This bill is sitting on the governor's desk, and we're really hopeful that he signs it.
Okay. I want to get back to the police reform and the police brutality real quick. You know, a lot of these bills that you guys are talking about, this is the first time I've heard of some of these bills. You know, right now I'm a little busy, so I can't follow all of these bills and what's going on. But I know in my lifetime, the number one thing that has affected our country and dividing our country is police brutality. Now, I have a lot of police officers that are friends, and I know 95% of our police officers are going to protect and serve us. But that 5% and those few bad apples, what do we have on the table that's going to hold them more accountable?
Well, if I can start, I would just say, you know, this is far bigger than any of our individual relationships. You know, I have family that are law enforcement, that are correctional officers. And how I feel about them is wildly different from how I feel about the system of policing itself. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a system. This is a set of institutions that are operating in such a fashion that you putting a personality in a position to do a job is not going to change the function of that system. And so kind of zooming back a bit and thinking about it from that perspective, I think is really important, because then we get out of the good cop versus bad cop, because it really is about a systemic issue and a failed system, in fact. And so we know, well, and it's debatable whether it's failed. Some people would argue that the system of policing is doing what it's always been intended to do, created as a vestige of slavery, really to track and control and maintain slaves and property. And so, you know, what we've tried to do is, one, shine a light on the practice of policing and just make sure that people understand some of the basics in terms of data and use of force, and some of those things that we know to be true in terms of, you know, the abuses that happen in communities of color specifically. And that hasn't been easy. Just very basic reforms to ensure that there's more transparency and that there's data. You know, these have been knocked down, drag out fights in the legislature, because the practice of policing, the system of policing, is protecting itself and trying to preserve its power and trying to limit the exposure to people calling for reform. So the first step is to, you know, have some transparency. And then for many of us, you know, the notion of accountability is difficult, but I do think that there are ways that we can hold officers accountable who have run afoul of the law or who violate people's rights. And there was a bill that was on the desk of several lawmakers this year, SB 731, authored by Stephen Bradford, which would have created a decertification scheme in California. California is, you know, one of only a handful of states in this nation that doesn't have a way to decertify officers who are bad actors. And so 45 other states do this. California does not. So, you know, you can have an officer who's fired in San Diego and he just goes to LA and gets a new job. And so, you know, decertification is a really important issue that we should all be paying attention to here in California. And so that's one way to hold folks accountable. And then there is the question of the types of immunities that officers have. They are protected over and above what your normal civil servants are able to, in terms of the protections that they have. They're protected over and above what normal civil servants are able to enjoy in terms of, you know, the types of immunities that they have. And we're trying to pierce some of that. At the local level, it's very difficult because, you know, it's a matter of U.S. Supreme Court law that has kind of created this immunity that they enjoy. But we want to be able to create a civil cause of action and allow for people to pursue civil suits against officers who violate their civil rights. So those are ways to advance accountability. And then finally, I would say that the next step is to create alternatives. We need alternative systems that we can begin to rely upon for community safety. I think what James said earlier is really critical and really important. The first thing that we learn in an econ class is, you know, the whole debate versus guns and butter. You either invest in guns or you invest in butter. And what we've done in our country is invest in guns, and the guns are police. And if we invest in butter, the butter could be housing, health, jobs, education. And those things, I think, are the things that foster safety. And in the event that there are crises, we need alternative systems to be able to rely upon. We need to be able to contact social workers. We need to be able to contact mental health workers. All these supportive services are really key. And right now, our state is so anemic in terms of the investments that we have in those spaces that the only option you have is to call the police, and that is a failed choice.
If I can underscore what Marc has said, the problem with the culture of policing is it runs so deep. It's not just a problem that the police think they are above the law. The police are the law, and they have been operating by their own rules. Marc and I worked for several years on California's landmark legislation to change the law about when police can legally kill. And the starting place, the law had said that a police officer in California could legally kill someone for simply failing to follow the officer's order. That was the law in California. It was written in 1871. So when Marc says that the rules for policing in California were written in the era of slavery, that's not hyperbole, that's literally true. And it took us 4 years to get the bill introduced to change the legal standard for use of force. And it took us 2 years to pass it. And it only became law because so many people stood up and so many members of the community took to the streets and to the State House and demanded action.
And if I can just round this out, and Jim, you started us off by talking about the Players Coalition's own journey and learning how much these issues can be quite local. Policing is intensely local as well. And one of the things that I encourage folks to do in their communities is to pay attention to when your police department's contract is up for renewal. And look at the draft contract and insert yourself as the community into those contract negotiations, because so many protections against accountability are written into those contracts. Funding is written into those contracts. And remember, it is a finite pie. Marc talked about this. If your city or your county is spending X percentage on a police state, that is resources that they cannot spend on the things that we know actually break cycles of crime and heal communities. So paying attention at the local level to how resources are being doled out and how much contracts and other local laws protecting officers so that they can act with impunity. I mean, that just has, and we rely on folks in their communities doing that. So please do that back in your communities.
Okay, thank you guys, that was good. Let me ask you something, because I get asked all the time, you know, what role do athletes play in this reform, and how can they help?
It's an excellent question. And one of the things that I would say to that is I've been so impressed this year with the way athletes and the sports industry as a whole has used their platform to elevate issues they're passionate about. I think that the thing that I'm learning over and over and over again is privilege is a fact of life, and status and platforms, these things exist. What matters is what you do with it and who else you bring along with you. And so to see athletes taking the lead and kind of like stepping away from the era of bland corporatism that I thought went through in the 80s and 90s of not being too controversial in order to not alienate anyone, but to instead embody their own full humanity and stand up for things that they believe in, I think is creating a new form of leadership in this country that is sorely needed. Each and every one of these leagues are primarily people of color who come from neighborhoods and that are not always the most privileged and successful. And to see them step into their power. And the one example that always comes out, I'm from Missouri. And so in 2014, when the football players from Mizzou boycotted a game because of the district attorney's refusal to indict the officer who killed Michael Brown, and said, well, we won't entertain you then. I think that has just been, and everything that has happened since has been crucial for elevating and making and raising awareness and bringing people into a conversation in a way that has really helped propel the social justice movement. So I just want to continue to encourage that. I think it's incredibly powerful that players are using their platforms to speak out on injustice.
And I want to thank the Players Coalition specifically for championing the Racial Justice Act. The Players Coalition did an op-ed, endorsed the bill, an op-ed that was written by 5 members of the Players Coalition: Juan Archuleta, Sebastian Joseph Day, Tori Holt, Mark Anthony Kay, Tyson Ross, all came together to do this op-ed, and then lifted it up on social media, have really been promoting the bill and directly contacting the governor to urge his support. So those are just some concrete examples of how the Players Coalition has leaned in to help fight for one specific bill.
I would just echo that. Players Coalition has been a huge supporter of the Crisis Act, and folks like Tori Holt have stepped up and have lifted this up on social media. And you know, I think to what James pointed out, you know, athletes have a very special role in our society, and for them to be a part of this in a way that builds the awareness and understanding amongst everyday people in a way that is, you know, far more pervasive than any of our organizations can do. You know, with our budgets and our size, you know, the platform that sports have in the public eye, I think is absolutely critical. And to see these issues, which are everyday issues and issues that many of these athletes experience in their own home communities, now kind of be a part of their conversation and their public life, I think is important. Because, you know, a whole generation of young people is looking to them, and without understanding how their experiences have shaped who they are and what they care about, it's very easy for those young people to sleepwalk through this moment and to miss the opportunity to also tap into their voice, their power. And so I'm thankful to the Players Coalition and to other spaces like this that are really being intentional about building the leadership, the voice, the savvy of people who are within their ranks to be able to engage on these really critical issues that, you know, are going to have an immediate impact and save lives and you know, help make our society so much stronger.
In the this last legislative session, a few of us have talked about a bill, the decertification bill, that did not pass because of law enforcement opposition. And one of the things that was effective, one of the only things that was effective at overcoming that law enforcement, the threats essentially that they're making to legislators. If you vote for this bill, we will come after you in your next election. That's power. The power that can overcome that was professional athletes tweeting using social media platforms to directly call out legislators and say, this bill is important. Why aren't you supporting it? And they actually were able to get some of the legislators who were saying they weren't going to vote for the bill to change their vote and to publicly say that. So weighing in on bills, you can make the difference in a legislator voting yes or no on a really important bill. You can call a legislator, you can reach out to the governor over social media. Natasha knows it, it's like @GavinNewsom, the handle. And those things really matter. It is about power countering power. And we're not going to be able to overcome this tremendous law enforcement and moneyed interests power without your power stepping in and doing that direct outreach. So really grateful to you all for stepping up when it matters.
Okay. All right, my last question for you guys, and you kind of answered a little bit there. Is there more need of public support to get these bills through to the governor? And if so, what can the people on this Zoom call do? Athletes, non-athletes, whoever, what can we do?
Well, there is absolutely a need for more support. For the Crisis Act in particular, we have heard from the staff from the governor's staff that there is the likelihood of a veto. And we feel like this is a bill that makes so much sense for our state, in particular in this moment. And so, the governor needs to hear from you. The governor needs to hear your voice. The governor needs to hear that you support the Crisis Act. And if you go to @Alliance4BMOC via Twitter, you can find all the information you need via the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. That's @AllianceFORBMOC. And you can go ahead and register your support by following the link in our profile to support the Crisis Act.
And what I would add is, in echoing what Natasha mentioned earlier about the fact that we do not yet have a law that makes racial discrimination in the courtrooms illegal, use the hashtags, #ConfrontRacism, #AB2542. Make your voices known, get out there and be heard in order to amplify this really easy sign off. It's beyond time for us to outlaw discrimination in our courtrooms.
Okay. You guys, that was a great education. You guys answered those questions well. That's all I have. I'm gonna pass it off to you, Cam.
I appreciate that, Coach. And being a former athlete from California, I think this conversation is extremely important. Mark, you mentioned sometimes sleepwalking through these issues. I found myself doing that. When George Floyd got killed, and my friends were like, "Hey, you need to step up. You need to say something." And at this moment, I put so much out there. I feel like a Black Panther. So I'm appreciative of Players Coalition and allowing us to have this conversation. So what I want to pass to you all is what's next, right? A lot of reform happens through the ballot initiatives, meaning propositions put on the November ballot. And there are two big ones on the table this year in November. And James, can you speak about Prop 17 and then pass it to Natasha and Ann about Prop 20, please?
Absolutely. I'm excited about Prop 17. Prop 17, it will allow people who are on probation or on parole the right to vote. I I think in this era, we're learning that the more voices that are weighing in on our democracy, the stronger our democracy is. And so there's an entire segment of our population that has paid their debt to society, but is still not yet able to vote in this upcoming election. Prop 17 will change that for the hundreds of thousands of people on parole in this state alone.
So what are some of the things that the people who are listening can do to make sure that California goes in the right direction for a more fair and just system? That goes to you all.
One thing I want to lift up is the Los Angeles District Attorney election. Los Angeles County is 1/3 of the criminal justice system here in California, and the district attorney is on the ballot this November. The voters of Los Angeles have a true choice between the candidates, and I really encourage folks, anyone who's in Los Angeles, to get involved in that election. You can learn about what the DA does by going to a great website called meetyourda.org. Just simply meet your DA, just to learn about the power of the district attorney in the criminal justice system, which is immense. If you want to get involved in the LA district attorney election, the best place to go is the DA Justice Coalition, which is focused on this district attorney's race. And the California League of Women Voters is doing great work to educate the voters of Los Angeles about the importance of this race. People don't realize that the DA is on the ballot. They don't learn about the differences between the candidates, and they don't end up voting. So we really need everyone in Los Angeles to engage in this race.
If I can add just a thank you, Natasha, for lifting that up. Black Lives Matter Los Angeles has been one of the key protagonists pushing that campaign to make sure that the DA race moves in a more fair and just direction. One of the other opportunities that I think is important to lift up is, and this is based on one of the questions in the chat, is, the question was, how can we get more of the cop labor union kind of influence out of the politics so that, we can advance equity in a way that, we're speaking about here. And one of the resources I just like to point people to is the nocopmoneycalifornia.com website, where you can use that website and resource to ask your local electeds to take the pledge and not take any campaign contributions from those entities.
Just by way of example, in the LADA race, over the last 2 weeks, the Prison Guards Union and the Los Angeles Police Union have poured $1.5 million to back the incumbent Jackie Lacey. So that is another example of the power of the district attorney. They know the power of the district attorney. They know how much the district attorney plays in shaping how many people are incarcerated for how long in this state. And so they're going to fight tooth and nail to keep the incumbent who leans heavily on a carceral state in office. So pay attention to that race.
Thank you all for that. You all hit some great points there. I think it's important we pay attention to who's in that DA race. Jim, I know we're on a time crunch here, so I'm going to pass it to you to wrap up tonight's conversation.
No, I appreciate it, Cam. One thing we know that you guys are phenomenal, first off, from my standpoint. The knowledge among this group has been tremendous. But we know there's a lot of work still to be done and a lot of opportunities over the next few months. And so I just want to go to each of you again to repeat, what can people do to be more involved? Where can they go to get more involved? And I'll start at the top of my screen with Ann.
I talked about using your platform, social media. I mean, it is such a powerful rod for folks to use now, a sword. Get out in the streets and protest. stand with, if you're in Los Angeles, there are weekly protests led for years, long before the cameras were there paying attention, by Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. Join those protests. It matters so much when folks show up to be with them in solidarity. This is one, I think, when you encounter those kind of fear-mongering tactics that have been so effective, that actually got us to where we are today in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when you encounter them in your own lives, counter them, you know, push back against them, remind people about what the data actually tells us, and that being reactionary, basing policies and approaches on a reactionary kind of reflex is harmful. So in your own lives. And then the other one I'd say, which is for us and this work is really the key to Hearts and Minds, is humanize. Tell the stories. Tell the stories of the people in your lives who have followed that path of redemption, who have turned their lives around, of the mothers who have worked so hard to get clean and get their kids back. Tell these stories that humanize the people who have been really drawn into a system that is so hard to get out of. When we humanize, if we can humanize, we really can unlock this thing. And that's where the power lies, the Hearts and Minds power.
Thank you. Natasha, how about you?
Learn about the role of the district attorney at meetyourda.org. Learn about the different positions of the candidates at the DA Justice Coalition.org. Get involved in making sure everyone you know in Los Angeles knows that the district attorney is on the ballot, the difference between the candidates, and to vote for the candidate that they think will advance justice.
Marc?
I would say, just similar to where Ann was going, it's before you pass any sort of judgment regarding how you feel about some of these issues we're lifting up, you know, it's important to talk to someone who is directly impacted. We work very closely with people who have lost loved ones due to police violence, and they are indeed the experts that guide and shape the policies that we end up developing and advancing in partnership with them through the Capitol. And talking to them, hearing their stories, understanding where they have come from and the road that they are traversing in their grief and pain is just so essential, because that is essentially, I think, where you begin to understand on a more visceral human level why some of these issues are so important. And so I would encourage people to have those conversations, to challenge themselves, and to, on the policy side, take action. As Ann mentioned, the governor is considering a whole host of bills that are on his desk. He pays attention to social media. He's very active on social media. I would encourage people to tweet at him, to use the hashtag Crisis Act. You can find details on how to do that at the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color Twitter, at Alliance FORBMOC, at Alliance for BMOC. And thank you all so much.
James, how about you?
I mean, I second everything and echo everything that's been said thus far. And I think what it always comes back to for me is think in your own life as to what provides safety, what has made you feel safe and secure in your own world, and then help amplify that value and stand with those who are seeking the same things in their own communities and lives.
I want to thank you all for your interest and your energy in this topic. And to those out there, I want to thank you for participating. So everyone, have a great day and stay safe.